My name is Amanda, and I work at the Heinz History Center. I'm here with Jocelyn, who I work with at the History Center. And you'll notice another name in the chat sometimes, Laura. Laura is running behind the scenes for us today to keep an eye on the chat and the Q&A. Students and teachers who are out there, we will not be able to see you today on video or hear you out loud today. The only way that you are able to talk to us is to talk in the chat. And so you can use that chat to tell us what your answers are to some of the questions we might ask, or if you have questions of your own or comments, you can put them in the chat, and Jocelyn and I and Laura will be able to see those. You can also use the Q&A function, and I see some people have already been putting things in the Q&A there, which is great. So those come just to us, the three of us who are running this, and then when we answer questions, you'll be able to see those in there too. So you can all use those to communicate with us. And we are going to get started here in just a moment. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be talking about Pittsburgh's abolitionists, and I'll tell you a little more about what that means, and especially a person whose name was Martin Delany. He's a really important person to Pittsburgh history. And so Jocelyn and I are going to be telling you some stories about some of those abolitionists who lived and worked here in Pittsburgh in Western Pennsylvania. And so I'm going to be sharing my screen. Once I start doing that, it's hard for me to see the chat. So Laura and Jocelyn will be keeping an eye on the chat while I am talking. And then we will go through this until we're done here at 10:45, and we will hopefully leave some time for questions at the end or sort of throughout as we go through and talk. So please, if you have questions as you're listening, drop them in the chat or the Q&A, and we can get to them as we go. All right. Anything we should get to before we get into it, Jocelyn or Laura?
I would just like to remind everyone that this is a webinar, so you can't see other people's faces, and we cannot see your faces. That's about it.
Great. Yes, it's like watching TV a little bit, but you can chat to us. So I'm going to go ahead and start my screen share so I can start the presentation today. Jocelyn and Laura know they can interrupt me at any time if anything comes up in the chat or the Q&A.
Yeah, and I will be back a little bit later.
Yes. Okay. Can you just let me know, Jocelyn or Laura, if that looks right?
You are good.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so I put up here a picture of the History Center just because I like to make sure you all know where we're sort of coming from. Jocelyn and I and Laura all work here at the Heinz History Center, this beautiful building in the Strip District in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We're obviously not there right now, but normally that's where we work, down in the Strip, in a great big beautiful museum that talks all about different parts of Pittsburgh history. And I like to say this before we get into this program today, because this program is put together for Black History Month. But we talk about these stories of Black history at the History Center all the time. This isn't just something we talk about in February. The stories that we will talk about today are part of what we talk about with students all the time. So really important note there. We focus a little more on it in Black History Month, but we talk about this stuff all the time. And so, as I said, today we're going to be talking about the story of Martin Delany and Pittsburgh Abolitionists. And so before we get into really talking about his story and the story of the other abolitionists around him, I just wanted to make sure that we cover a few words that we're going to use. If you all attended last week's session, you've seen most of these now, but I just want to make sure for everyone who's new that we go over some of the vocabulary that we'll be talking about today. And so you might hear me say, or Jocelyn say, the word enslaved person. And so that is a word that we now use when people used to use the word slave a lot. So we've kind of changed it. A lot of people now are choosing to use enslaved person instead of slave, because it has that word person in it. And it helps us to remember that those enslaved people were people, right? They had lives, they had families, they had feelings. They were people. And so we don't use the word slave if we can avoid it. We use an enslaved person to mean that same thing. So people who had to live on maybe a plantation, they weren't paid for their work, and they didn't have the freedom to leave. We also use this word freedom seeker a lot. So sometimes people use the word fugitive slave or runaway slave or escaped slave. If you were to come to the History Center and visit us, you would see us using the word freedom seeker instead of those words. And that's because, again, when we're talking about people who escaped from a plantation or escaped from slavery, if we call them an escaped slave, we're still using that slave word. And those people had changed their situation when they left a plantation. They were not enslaved anymore. And so freedom seeker is the word that we use because they were people who had chosen to seek their freedom. You'll also hear us using the word abolitionist a lot today. That's what we're talking mostly about. So abolitionists were people who worked to end slavery. They could be white people who thought that slavery was wrong and maybe gave some money or supported the end of slavery in some way. They could be Black people who were trying to help other Black people get to freedom or encouraging more people to be against slavery. So abolitionists can be all different kinds of people, but they were all working to end slavery. We might mention the Underground Railroad today a little bit. That was this sort of secret network of people who were helping freedom seekers get from slavery to freedom. So it wasn't a railroad, it wasn't like a subway system, there were no real trains involved. It was very much a secret network of people and places that they could hide people as they were trying to get to freedom. And the last one here, we're going to talk about at the end. It is the Fugitive Slave Law, which is something that happened in America in 1850. And it made it illegal for someone to help a freedom seeker get to freedom. So anyone who knew about freedom seekers or was helping them could get in a lot of trouble. So that's something that we're going to talk about today. Because it fits into the time period that we're looking at, which is just before the Civil War, so maybe about the 1830s up until the 1860s is what we're going to be talking about today. And so I put up this picture here on your screen, and I wonder if you can take a look at this image for a moment. And in the chat, if you want to tell us what you can see here, if you notice any words or any dates, or what do you think you're looking at in terms of what the picture is? Tell us what you think. Let's see if anyone knows.
We have a lot of people in the chat saying that they see the date 1838.
Yes, 1838, very good.
That it's a woman. Oh, someone said that it's enslaved person.
It is
Girl
an
and change.
Yes.
We also have someone pointing out that slogan at the top of it, "Am I not a woman and a sister?"
Yes. And a sister. Very good. Very good. Yes, that's all absolutely right. And this is a coin. We call it an abolition token. And so it's maybe a little bit bigger than a quarter in real life. And we have one on display in the museum and one that we also, when people can come there, we let them actually touch one of these. And you're right, around the edge it says, "Am I not a woman and a sister?" And this is from 1838. And this token is something that abolitionists would use to sort of support the abolitionist movement. So maybe they would have some sort of like a fundraiser where they were trying to raise money for the abolitionist movement. And they would sell these tokens to people who also supported the end of slavery. So they could have something that they maybe sort of leave in their house somewhere as sort of a symbol that they also support the end of slavery. So that "Am I not a woman and a sister" that you see around the edge there is trying to get people to think about the fact that these enslaved people were people. And they are women and they are sisters, and they were individual people who were in that situation. So I always like to start with that just because it kind of gets us to think about what these abolitionists were trying to tell people when they were trying to end slavery. Anything else about that before we move on, Jocelyn?
Just a lot of people kind talking about what they see on the coin, someone on their knees. And then someone said it's a metaphor for being enslaved. So.
Yeah, very good. Very good. So yes, they used a lot of these different kinds of symbols. And I think this is a really interesting one. Okay, I'm going to move on here to put up this map. And I'm just going to talk about this for a second because the next map I'm going to show you kind of gets to this too. But just in case people are joining us not from Pittsburgh, which I think might be true, this is where we are located here in Pittsburgh in Western Pennsylvania. I put this up because where Pittsburgh is located is really important to the story of abolitionists here in the city. Because this line here that you see, this southern border of Pennsylvania, is what we call the Mason-Dixon line. That is the line between the North and the South in the Civil War, but also the line between states that had slavery and states that did not have slavery in the time that we're talking about. And so we're just down here in this little corner of Pennsylvania. And if I bring up this next map here, this is a map of what is now the United States, or most of it. And over here you can see these white colored states here. These are all states that before the Civil War allowed slavery. So we call them slave states in this, when we learn about this. Those are the states that allowed slavery. These gray colored states here did not allow slavery. So those are free states. And you can see that if we're in this little corner down here of Pennsylvania where my cursor is, we are very close to that line. And so that means that there are a lot of freedom seekers coming through this area to try to get to the north and get to probably Canada. And also that there are a lot of abolitionists moving around here and maybe living in Pennsylvania and in Pittsburgh for some parts of their life because there was so much of that activity going on here. So where we are located is really important to the story. We also, I put up this chart here because there were a lot of African-American people living in Pittsburgh at the time that we're talking about. So if you take a look here in 1830, there's just under 500 African-American people living here in the city. By 1840, there's over 700. And by 1850, that shoots way up to almost 2,000 Black people living here in the city. Now, that wasn't a huge part of the population. There were lots and lots of other people living here, but that means that there was a real community of Black people living here in Pittsburgh long before the Civil War, even really from the start of Pittsburgh being a city. We'll talk about, you might notice this chart kind of drops down here. We'll talk about why that is towards the end. And so Black people were living here in the city. A lot of them were doing really, really well here in the city, making a lot of money, building a great community. But the city was still an American city in the 1800s. Things were not perfect for the Black people who were living here. They were free Black people, most of them, but they still faced racism and discrimination. So there were segregated churches. So there were churches for Black people and churches for white people. There were almost everything else was kind of segregated like that too. And Black people were not allowed to attend the public schools in Pittsburgh until 1838, when they made a school just for Black students. So while they were here and a lot of them were thriving, things were not perfect here in Pittsburgh for the Black residents. And so from here, we're going to talk a little more about these individual people who were working as abolitionists. And that's where I'm going to hand it over to Jocelyn.
Hello, everyone. You're all asking really great questions, so keep it up. So we're going to take a closer look at Martin Delany. He is someone who came to Pittsburgh at a very young age, around 16. Martin Delany was born in 1821 to a free woman and enslaved laborer in Charlestown, Virginia. So that's right below that Mason-Dixon line. Because of his mother's free status, Martin Delany was also considered a free person, so he was born free. Martin Delany's mother was one of the first people that really started to shape Martin's ideas and beliefs. She wanted to educate her children and began to teach them how to read using the New England Primer. So if Amanda would click a little, that book would pop up. And that is something that a lot of people during the early 1800s would use to teach each other to read. And now this was extremely dangerous for her to do because she lived south of that Mason-Dixie line in a state that participated in slavery. Southern states like that had anti-literacy laws, meaning they didn't want people that were African Americans to be able to read, whether they were free or enslaved. So in 1812, she decided to move to the free state of Pennsylvania and settled in Chambersburg, which is right above that line. So she would be able to provide for her children and give them an education. Later in his life, in 1830, Delany left Chambersburg for the larger city to the east, which was Pittsburgh. There he hoped to really further his education. So when Delany arrived in the city of Pittsburgh, there had already been an established Black population. So there was already a big community of African Americans that were knitted together and really helped each other out. This community had its own churches, schools, and organizations to support each other. There were also a lot of successful businessmen that were African American in the city at the time. They were able to own and operate these different places that would serve everyone in Pittsburgh. So white, Black, poor, rich. These businessmen often became leaders in their community. So it was from these different leaders that Delany learned his ideas from. Amanda, if you could click to the next screen for me. So the first businessman we're going to talk about, well, first, this is a map of early Pittsburgh around 1850. It's one of the earliest maps. It was one of the maps that we have from around the time that Delany was in the city. The one from 1830 was a little too blurry for us to really mark on it the places we're going to be talking about. So the first place that we're talking about is that little star right there, which was John Vashon's Barbershop. Go ahead and click to the next slide for me. So John Vashon was a barber, and he also owned the first bathhouse in Pittsburgh. We know this because he put a lot of ads in different newspapers from throughout the time. So this to the right of the screen is one of those ads that John Vashon would put in the newspaper. He was one of the richest and most well-known men in Pittsburgh. And because of these businesses, it allowed him to form different relationships with different members of the Pittsburgh community. Amanda, if you could click to the next screen for me. So in this image, this would be a typical image of a barbershop, much like what would happen at John Vashon's place. In this image, you could see African-American man that is the barber who is attending to white clientele. So because he was allowed to have these relationships, the barbershop was also a place that had a lot of different conversation happening. And this conversation often led to sharing ideas with different members of the community. So he was able to use this as both a business, but also as a social gathering where they could share ideas and really form these relationships that would also further the idea of abolition, so ending of slavery. He also used these different businesses to help freedom seekers as they would move throughout Pittsburgh. Go ahead and click to the next screen for me, please. And then another one of those leaders in the abolitionist movement was Lewis Woodson. So he came to Pittsburgh to really join the Bethel AME Church, which is that next star that popped up on the map. Go ahead and click on for me. So he originally came to Pittsburgh to be a reverend at the Bethel AME, but it didn't pay a lot of money, so he also was a barber on the side so he could really make a living. It was from Woodson that Martin Delany really learned some of his key ideas of really elevating the African American people. So kind of raising them up and making their life better. Woodson wrote a series of letters to an African American newspaper called the New York Colored American, which was a weekly newspaper from New York City. And those letters really outlined his ideas. They could focus on moral social, and political improvement to really raise up free colored people. And by doing that, he believed that that would lead to the emancipation of those enslaved. So he thought that by bettering the condition of those that are free, it would lead to the freeing of those enslaved people in the South. He also believed that African Americans should have their own schools, newspapers, and churches. Woodson was one of those people that linked the success of free Black people in northern cities and states to those that were still enslaved. So we really focus on the whole of the African American people. And by doing this, he focused on both injustices in the North and enslavement in the South. He thought that by building up free communities, they could help those that would eventually gain their freedom. Go ahead and click the next slide for me. And he did this throughout his time in Pittsburgh. And one of those things that he did to really invest in his community, by first with the church, he also formed the African Education Society with John Vashon, that other businessman that we spoke about just a little earlier. And they hoped that education would be the path that Black people could really take in the United States to gain equality. So creating this education society, they were able to create a school that was taught out of the AME church. And Woodson was one of the first teachers there. And it was that school that Martin Delany would attend to really further his education. So if we look at that newspaper ad right to this, Amanda is pointing at something that we call the Anti-Slavery Almanac. So that was something that a lot of people published. So a lot of people at this time were banned from schools if they were African Americans. So they had to form their own schools, which is something that John Vashon and Woodson did. So if we look at the ad to the right of the screen that says African Education Society, this is something that was published in a newspaper, and it really outlined why they created the society. And it was stating that they thought ignorance was the sole cause of the present degradation and bondage. And by ignorance, I mean the lack of knowledge was what caused African Americans to be in the state that they were in now. So both enslavement and facing these many injustices. So they really wanted to elevate their character and educate them. And they thought that by doing this, it would get them out of the situation that they were currently in, which was facing many different discriminations in the North and enslavement in the South. I'm going to click to the next slide. So Black people weren't the only ones that were involved in the abolitionist movement in Pittsburgh. A lot of these successful businessmen also formed partnerships and connections with their white counterparts. And this is where I'm going to hand it back to Amanda. Before that, was there anything in the chat that questions? I read that I froze, which is why I paused for a moment.
Oh. Someone pointed out when you were talking about Woodson, they said they kind of compared him to Martin Luther King Jr. when you were talking about education. I thought that was really interesting. Laura, was there anything that I missed? Just let us know if there was. I feel like that's pretty much it so far.
Yeah, I'm sort of answering some one-off questions. The one question that I haven't answered yet was if we can talk a little bit about why the Mason-Dixon line was called the Mason-Dixon line, if we know the answer to that.
So the Mason-Dixon line was called the Mason-Dixon line because it actually started out as an exploration of, I believe, the Delaware River. So and that line really became what is what separated those states. So Delaware, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Maryland. And because it fell exactly on that line, and those are the states that participated in slavery in the South and didn't participate in slavery in the North, it really became associated with the Civil War. and the separations of the South and North.
Thank you for answering that one. As I look here, oh, someone asked if the church is still there.
So the church is not still there. It was originally located in that spot that that star appeared on. And then during the Great Fire of 1845, it burned down, and they moved a little bit further out of town to something that was called Arthursville at the time. And then that church was unfortunately knocked down in like the mid 1950s, I believe.
Yeah, but the Bethel AME congregation is still there. It's just in a different place. Very good.
Great. I think we've got most of them then.
Okay.
All right, thanks for asking. I'm going to disappear and I'll be back a little later.
All right. So Jocelyn talked about a couple of particularly Black people who were abolitionists in Pittsburgh who were doing some of that work. But there were other people here who were doing that as well. There were also white abolitionists. And so in Pittsburgh, these white abolitionists and Black abolitionists are kind of sometimes working together on trying to end slavery. And so these are two people who were here around that same time as the people that we've already talked about. Jane Grace Swisshelm is a really interesting historic person. She was a journalist. She wrote in newspapers about ending slavery. She also worked a lot on women's rights, and she came from here in Pittsburgh. She also lived in other places around the country doing that work. And Charles Avery is another really interesting one because Charles Avery is a person who owned cotton mills. So he was actually making money off of the cotton that was grown on plantations in the South. And at some point in his life, he realized that he had a problem with that, in that he didn't want to be supporting slavery in that way. So he opened up a school here in Pittsburgh to educate African-American children. He also became a very, very strong abolitionist. We'll hear from something that he said in a second here when we start talking about the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. So not only were those Black people helping other Black people, there were white people in the city kind of helping them to do that, and also even working on the Underground Railroad themselves. So it was a nice sort of mix of different types of people here who were all dedicated to that same thing. And so when we look at this map here and we start to see another star pop up here, we've got John Vashon, Bethel AME, and now you see Martin Delany pop up here. So when Martin Delany came to Pittsburgh, as Jocelyn pointed out there, it was because there were all of these other people working on things that he also cared about who were already here. And so Martin Delany comes to Pittsburgh as a young man. He lives here for a while doing all different kinds of things, getting really connected to this abolitionist community. So there's a picture of Martin Delany here when he was living in Pittsburgh. And a lot of abolitionists would have contributed to newspapers. So they wrote newspapers, they wrote articles for newspapers. If you know of a famous abolitionist named Frederick Douglass, he wrote a newspaper called the North Star. And Martin Delany actually helped him with that newspaper for a while. And so Martin Delany became one of the more famous abolitionists to come out of Pittsburgh. And he actually wrote his own newspaper for a while too. And that newspaper was called The Mystery. And so he was publishing this newspaper called The Mystery from Pittsburgh. He called it that because he wanted to tell people about the evils of slavery, but he also wanted Black people to start to understand what was happening, because so many people were not educated and they didn't understand what was happening. And he really wanted to use his newspaper to do that. So maybe someone would get the newspaper and be able to read it out to other people and sort of share that information. So a lot of abolitionists use newspapers as a way to share their thoughts and to share their information. And Martin Delany is a person who did that a lot. And that made him very popular amongst abolitionists. So when people talk about Pittsburgh abolitionists, he's a person that a lot of people are going to talk about just because he was known outside of this area. So Martin Delany is here. He's working on The Mystery. He's connected to all of these other abolitionists. They are sharing information, they're helping on the Underground Railroad, they're doing everything that they can do as people to try to end slavery. Now they're working on that here from Pennsylvania, trying to encourage people around the country to sort of get on board. And especially in the story of Martin Delany, things change a little bit in 1850. And so in 1850, there is a law that is passed called the Fugitive Slave Law, sometimes the Fugitive Slave Act. Here you can see it says Fugitive Slave Bill. They're all the same thing. And this changes things a lot for these abolitionists and for freedom seekers. And this is a real sort of turning point in this whole story, because the Fugitive Slave Law is a law that is passed by Congress. So this is a law that is for the entire country. This isn't just a state. This isn't just the South. This is a law for the whole entire country that says that any person who is helping a freedom seeker could be punished with jail time or punished with fines. And so anybody who saw a freedom seeker trying to get to freedom and didn't turn them in, or anybody who maybe gave some food to a freedom seeker or was helping on the Underground Railroad or anything like that, it made those people who were helping into criminals. And so if a freedom seeker was escaping and they were caught by one of these people called marshals, these people who were in charge of enforcing this new law, they had no way to argue their case. And so if a freedom seeker was trying to get to freedom, or if a free Black person was caught by a marshal, there was no way that they could defend themselves. They had no right to a court case, no right to a trial or anything like that. It was just the word of the marshal against their word. And those marshals made money, more money, if they returned a freedom seeker to slavery than if they got to let a person go. And so I think that gives us an indication that they would have wanted to be catching people and returning them to the South. And so for all those freedom seekers coming north, this was really scary. For any Black person living in America at the time, even in the North, even if they had been free their whole life, this was really scary, because it meant that now everyone around them had reason to be suspicious about them, or reason to maybe even turn them into a marshal and get them sent back to the South. It also meant that for people who were living in parts of the North who maybe weren't really thinking about slavery much, it didn't affect them directly very much, this law meant that it did, because now everybody was in a position where if they knew about a freedom seeker, they couldn't really just let it go, because they could get in trouble. And so this really, really changes things. The goal of the law was to stop people from escaping from these plantations. But it kind of backfired in that it really made more people become abolitionists. So in Pittsburgh, you see lots and lots more people start doing this. A lot more meetings get reported in newspapers of abolitionists meeting together. The Underground Railroad has more and more people coming through it at that time. A lot of the Black abolitionists and a lot of Black people go to Canada. So if you listened last week, you know we talked about when Charlie Garlick went to Canada. Martin Delany does the same thing. For a little bit of time while this was happening, he moves to Canada so that he is not at risk of this law anymore. And lots of northern states pass laws that kind of try to get around the Fugitive Slave Law, and that's something that we say ends up leading to the Civil War. Now, Charles Avery, who was one of those white abolitionists here in the city, gave a couple of speeches about this law when it was passed and how he thought it was a terrible thing. And so he was a reverend or a minister in a church. And so what his view of this law was, he said, it would force ministers whose duty it was to proclaim peace in the world and to let the captive go free, to instead aid and assist the bloodhounds of slavery, and to join in this work of crime. And so what he's saying there is these people who are trying to do good, right? Abolitionists, church people who believe that slavery is wrong and helping people get to freedom is the right thing to do, are now being turned into criminals by this law. And Martin Delany gives a lot of really, really strong speeches too. And if you come to the museum and get to look around in there, there's a section of the From Slavery to Freedom exhibit where you see this statue of Martin Delany, and you can hear him giving this speech in the background where he says, under this bill, no colored person is safe. And his speech is all about how, he now feels once this law is passed, like he would have to carry a piece of paper with him that proves his freedom, even though he was born free. And that is not something that he is willing to tolerate. And so lots of these abolitionists come out very strongly against this law, and it means more and more and more people in the North are starting to feel like slavery is something that needs to end. And so that kind of leads us into this next little section of Martin Delany's life that kind of gets into that, working towards the end of slavery. And so Jocelyn, I would like to call you back to finish us off at the end here.
All right, before you disappear, there's some questions that,
yes.
There's just one main question that someone was questioning the Fugitive Slave Act, and they were saying, so there were bounties on people.
Yes, okay, so there's a couple things. Yeah, there's a couple things there. So first of all, when a freedom seeker would escape, often the slaveholder that they escaped from would put out an ad or like a poster or something that described these people, the freedom seeker, and gave a reward for their return. So there was that kind of bounty out for freedom seekers directly from the slaveholder. But what this law said was that these marshals would now make money if they found freedom seekers and returned them. And so that's another level of a person having a bounty out for them. And so that is pretty much true, yes. And it also meant that people who didn't report freedom seekers or who hid freedom seekers had a penalty, like they would get jail time or fines if they were charged with that. So a few different levels there, but yes.
And then I also have a question in the chat about Martin. I guess we mentioned that Martin Delany was going to be a doctor.
Yeah.
And someone said, but why couldn't he be a doctor? And why couldn't he go to college with white men? And I know that we're not going to get super deep into that. So when Martin Delany was in Pittsburgh, he did study with a few doctors here, and he applied to Harvard Medical School, which he attended for one semester before he was removed. And that was because the other, and he did this with a few other African Americans that were also allowed into Harvard. But the white students there didn't agree to going to school with them. So they created a petition to have them removed. They weren't against them getting an education, but they just didn't want it to be with them. Is there anything you wanted to add about that, Amanda?
No. I mean, I think that's pretty much it. You can look up the petition in the Harvard Medical School has an archive where they keep all this information, and you can actually read the petition, and it's quite a shocking thing to see like written down like that. But yeah, they just didn't want him in classes with them.
Also, he wasn't officially a doctor. A lot of people referred to him as doctor, especially in Pittsburgh newspaper, because he did do that.
Jocelyn, your video just got garbled, at least for me. So maybe if you leave the audio and try to add it back in for a second.
And while Jocelyn's doing that, we have one more question. Were there people that would read the mystery to other freedom seekers? So helping people who couldn't read the mystery in other papers to read them?
Yeah, absolutely. And so that was the idea of a lot of these newspapers, is that maybe one person would be able to read enough to read it out loud to lots of other people. And that's how a lot of that information was shared. So, and that wasn't only just amongst Black people. There were a lot of white people who maybe wouldn't have been able to read well enough to read a whole newspaper. And so someone would be reading it out loud to other people pretty often. Yeah.
Thanks.
Good question. All right, Jocelyn, do you want to try your sounds again and see if that's working?
Do I sound better? Give me a second.
No. It's okay. I can finish off this last little part for you, if that's okay. Okay. Jocelyn's been having internet problems today, so I will just talk about this last section for her. Martin Delany, after he went to Canada during this time of the Fugitive Slave Act, ended up coming back to Western Pennsylvania and coming back to the United States when the Civil War was beginning, because he saw that the Civil War was maybe the key to getting this slavery situation dealt with once and for all. And so lots of people joined something called the U.S. Colored Troops, which is what happened after the Emancipation Proclamation in the Civil War, when Black people in the South were mostly freed from slavery. A lot of them were able to join the Northern Army as part of the U.S. Colored Troops. And so they were a segregated part of the Army, but it meant that Black people from all over the country could now fight on the side of the Northern Army to fight against slavery. And so the picture that you see there are some of the U.S. Colored Troops who were in Pennsylvania. So people from this area would have done that. Remember Charlie Garlick from last week joined the U.S. Colored Troops. The important part of the Martin Delany story is that Martin Delany became the highest ranking African-American in the military. He achieved the rank of major. You can see down there Martin Delany as major. So Martin Delany not only was an abolitionist and did all of that work, but he also actually worked really hard in the Civil War. He had meetings with Abraham Lincoln to get his point across to him. So not only was he an abolitionist, but he also was really important to that story too. So he would have been in charge of people, of Black soldiers in the US military as part of the US Colored Troops. And that kind of gets us to the end of our presentation here. We can take a couple of questions, I think, if anyone has any. I know we're at 10:45, so if any of you do need to leave, that is, of course, totally fine, but I can take a moment to answer any last little questions that we might have.
Amanda, we had a question about whether we could tell anybody anything about Martin Delany's family.
Yeah, so Martin Delany, his wife did a lot of similar abolitionist work. Her name was Catherine. And he also had a lot of children, and he named his children really interesting names that were after other sort of Black, sort of like freedom fighters. So a lot of different names that he picked from other parts of the world where Black people had to fight for their freedom too. So yes, he did have a wife who did a lot of work with him, and quite a few children as well.
And then there are a couple of questions about the what would happen if people were arrested. Were people arrested for having slaves after they could not have slaves anymore? So after slavery ended?
That's a good question. And I don't know that I have a straight answer for that. To my knowledge, once slavery was ended, especially in the South, they were in the middle of the Civil War, and things just got very sort of complicated and messy as people tried to leave plantations or didn't have anywhere to go and had to stay and work anyway. So that's a hard one to answer. And I might have to just see if there were any particular cases where that happened. I don't know of any off the top of my head. Might be something to research a little better.
And then the other question that I was trying to tie to it, and I've gotten a little lost in my list, was a question about excuse me, what would the marshals do if they captured a freedom seeker? What would they do with that person?
Yes. So what they were supposed to do was capture the person and keep them somewhere, so sort of like a jail or something like that. And then they were to bring them back to where they thought they came from. And there was a sort of like a sort of legal thing that they had to go through in order to do that. But it basically meant going to a judge and saying, this person is a freedom seeker and I'm taking them back to where they came from. There was no real conversation about it. And like I said, there was no trial or anything like that. So it was very much just like get the person and take them to back into slavery.
Great. Well, so knowing that we're at time and we have a couple of people that have to go, we should probably throw the Kahoot information into the chat.
Yes. So Jocelyn should, if she's still with us, I hope she didn't get kicked off. If Jocelyn could drop that information for us, the Kahoot, into the chat there. Students were offering a Kahoot quiz that goes over some of the stuff that we covered today. You will have until March 1st to do this Kahoot because we're doing one for each of these Thursday programs. At the end, we'll email your teachers and tell them how everyone did to see how people did in terms of what information you remembered when you did the Kahoot. But once you have that link, you can go ahead and do it whenever you want to. And then, yeah, teachers, you can look out for an email from us. Later, we'll send the recording of this and those Kahoot links again. So if you missed them today, you will get them there. I'll send that out this afternoon. So yes, I see Jocelyn just put that into the chat there. You can see the link to the Kahoot for this grade level.
And Amanda, I wasn't listening well enough, but there was a question, will this be on YouTube? Did you say that?
Yes, it will be also on YouTube. So we're recording these so that we can send them out to teachers and students, but we are also going to put them on YouTube so that people can go back and watch them whenever. Even in future years, if you found it interesting and you want to come back to it next February, they will be there on the History Center's YouTube page.
I did put in the chat that 3 to 6th grade Kahoot.
Great.
I hope I don't sound weird anymore.
No, you're good. Thank you, Jocelyn. Okay. I feel like now we have gone over a few minutes and we should probably wrap up unless there's any like big lingering questions there, Laura.
I think we've gotten them.
All right.
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming and asking such great questions.
Yes, thank you all so much.
I did have one question at the very beginning. Someone said, will there be a prize for the winners?
So we don't have specific prizes that we are giving out as the History Center. Maybe you can ask your teachers if they have ideas for prizes that they can do in your school for people who do well in the Kahoots. But we don't have anything that we can send out from the History Center this time. So good question though. All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much for learning along with us about Pittsburgh's abolitionist history. It's a really important part of our local history here. Thank you to Laura for keeping an eye on the chat and for Jocelyn, for helping out with that and helping with the presentation as well. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of your week and have a great day.